and delightful as fabrics for a couple of reasons. One, they were cotton-based, right? So this was a tremendous innovation just in terms of the soft nature of the cotton itself. Up until that point, you could wear these fabrics, among other things, as underwear, which was a tremendous innovation because up until that point, people wore wool underwear. And you can imagine rainy, cold London with wool underwear was not so delightful. So suddenly you had this great breakthrough just in terms of the kind of the sensual feel of the fabric, but also the dyes, the patterns on calico and chintz, which had been pioneered by Indian dyers hundreds of years before. Beautiful, vibrant colors and patterns that, for the first time, could survive being washed multiple times. They didn't fade after you washed them 2 or 3 times like other fabrics did. And so the combination of the feel and the look, the kind of delight in this fabric, created this overwhelming craze for calico and chintz, which led to enormous profits for the East India Company, a massive trade imbalance that opens up between England and India. And it creates, and here you hear a direct echo of our own political moment and some of the issues that Micah was talking about, it ends up devastating the local wool industries in northern England, who are losing all this money now that the well-to-do women in London are no longer buying wool, they're buying cotton, this overseas exotic fabric from across the world. And so it triggers within about 20 or 30 years, starting in these stores, a political backlash, and actually a kind of weirdly misogynist backlash against these women who are seen as betraying the British economy and all these kind of woolen industries in the north through their sensual embrace of this exotic fabric from India. And so they're actually branded as, they're called calico madams. And all these poems and pamphlets and angry screeds are written in plays and songs are written about these evil calico madams. It's kind of a make England's wool industry great again kind of movement. I don't know if they had hats, but it's the same issue, right? It's the same kind of forces at our work. And for a while, calico and chintz were actually banned inside of England. But of course, at the same time, as this reaction is happening, another group of people, of inventors and entrepreneurs, start to think, well, wait a second, what if we used some new technology we have and our new understanding of how steam power could work, and we could make semi-automated looms that could produce some of these fabrics on our own shores here, and that is the birth of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is driven by textile innovation. And what is so interesting about this is that the normal way we tell this story, like where did the Industrial Revolution come from? Where did that good idea come from, right? Well, the traditional telling of it is that there was a bunch of brilliant entrepreneurs and inventors who came up with this new technology and imagined a new industrial system and a factory system and all of that. All of which is true. They certainly were central to that story. But if you're trying to figure out what was the spark, what were the initial forces that made that set of ideas possible or thinkable, it actually starts with that moment of delight, of that interest in this new fabric, that kind of consumer moment of saying, oh, that's interesting, I'd like to wear that on my body. And that sets in motion a chain of events that eventually leads to industrialization. And of course, a number of horrible things that end up happening, right? I mean, you cannot tell the story of slavery in the American South without the importance of cotton. In fact, if the South had not become economically dependent on cotton, it's likely that slavery might have ended much earlier and the Civil War might have never happened. So it's not that these delightful, playful experiences only lead to good experiences, right? You could make the argument that with industrial conditions and slavery in the American South, that cotton was the worst thing that happened to the world for about 150 years. But nonetheless, it was crucial. It was transformative. And if you don't tell the story, including those moments of wonder and amazement in a storefront in London, you miss an important part of the chain of events that actually brought it into being. A lot of this also revolves around both these themes of globalization, because we find delightful things in other cultures, but also innovation, coming up with new technologies. And the book actually begins with a story about Baghdad at the height of the Islamic Golden Age, kind of 8th, 9th century AD. Baghdad was arguably the most advanced city in the world at this point. And they had a great institution there called the House of Wisdom, which I love that name. And the House of Wisdom was kind of a mix of a maker lab and a translation bureau and a kind of a think tank. And there were all these engineers working at the House of Wisdom, including these brothers called the Banu Musa. And they did some of the most advanced engineering work in that period anywhere in the world, a whole set of innovations in hydraulics and float valve systems and accurate clocks, more accurate than anything Europe would see for 500 or 600 years. And they collected a bunch of these designs in a series of books that had great names like the Book of Ingenious Devices, some of which are beautiful illustrations that are reproduced in Wonderland. But what's amazing, if you look through this book, you can see how advanced their engineering is, except that what really strikes you is not just how advanced it is, but that every single device in the book is, in one way or another, a toy. They're all little automated playthings. There's like an elephant clock. There's a little automated peacock that you pull its feathers and it dispenses a bar of soap. There are little automated musical instruments and musical players. So you have this very interesting contrast between some of the most advanced engineering in the world and child's play, right? It looks like it's something that might be in a kindergarten classroom now, coupled with all these breakthrough ideas. And in fact, maybe the most important idea that the Banu Musa came up with is actually not included in these main books. It was almost lost to history until we discovered it about 100 years ago. I didn't discover it. Somebody discovered it about 100 years ago in a library in Syria. And it was a description of a contraption they called the instrument that plays itself. This is a reconstruction of the instrument from a couple years ago in a German exhibition. And the instrument was a mechanical, it was a kind of technology to support a mechanical flute player. So you had a little kind of robot that would seemingly play the flute. It was actually behind the scenes, it was an organ that was basically making the sounds. But what made it so radical as a technology is the whole thing was controlled by a rotating metallic cylinder with little pins on the cylinder to control the notes and the length of the notes that you wanted to play. So it was like a big music box, basically. And what was so interesting about the device, and what the Banu Musa were very excited about, and they wrote about extensively in their notes on it, was that if you wanted it to play a different song, you could take out this cylinder, cut a new set of codes, pins, corresponding to the new melody you wanted it to play, swap that out, put a new one in, and it would play a completely different song. So this was truly the first programmable machine. It was the first machine that was designed to be open-ended in what it actually did, and if you wanted to have it behave in a different way, you created a different set of codes to instruct the machine how to perform. So the whole idea of the opposition between hardware and software, such a fundamental category in modern life, really begins with this automated music machine. And in fact, that idea of programmability is kept alive by music for 500, 600 years, all the way into the 1700s in music boxes and other kind of programmable music machines, until a number of inventors in the mid-1700s, including Jacques de Vaucanson, the French inventor, begin to think about how this idea of programmability could be expanded. Vaucanson is most famous for building all these amazing automatons, these little kind of robotic toys. His most notorious one was known as the digesting duck. And it was a very lifelike kind of robot duck that, as you can kind of see, it would actually, you could feed it food and it would process the food and then expel the food out there. You see the arrow. It was also known as the defecating duck. And this is what people would do in Paris in like fancy drawing rooms in 1740, is this mechanical duck, they'd feed the duck and then watch it do its business. It was like the PlayStation of the pre-revolutionary France. So Vaucanson was doing all these crazy contraptions. Again, there's no point to this, no utilitarian function to this at all. It's just interesting, but it's some of the most advanced engineering in the world. And he starts to think right around this time, he's like, well, listen, if we can program these machines to behave in a lifelike manner, what if we could take some of that the concept of programmability and apply it to slightly more functional things. What if we created a programmable loom where we could instruct the machine to weave a particular pattern based on instructions, just like the instructions were encoding for these machines to play music. And he actually builds a couple of these machines in the 1740s with rotating mechanical cylinders, just like the ones pioneered by the Banu Musa 1,000 years before. But they're too clunky, it's too expensive to cut the cylinders, and the patterns have to be very repetitive because they cycle every time that the cylinder rotates. So it's not for another 50 years that until another French inventor, directly inspired by Vaucanson, decides to tackle this problem again, only this time he uses paper punch cards, not rotating mechanical cylinders, and you could stack an infinite number of cards describing the pattern you wanted it to weave, and you could have an infinitely long pattern in the fabric. And that became the jacquard loom, one of the most important advances in the history of textile automation. But it also directly influenced Charles Babbage, who created the first programmable computer about 20 years later, using paper punch cards that he got directly from jacquard. And as some of you know, I'm old enough to remember this, punch cards continued to be a part of programming and getting output from computers into the 1970s. So if you ask yourself the question, where did the computer come from? Where did the modern programmable computer, that defining technology of our time, where did it come from? Well, the traditional story is it came from the war effort, it came from cracking the Enigma codes, it came from calculating rocket trajectories, and came out of big industry and big IBM-like companies. Well, yes, of course, that is all part of the story, but it also came, in a very real sense, out of automated flute players and digesting ducks and weaving beautiful patterns of fabric. And again, if you only tell the story the traditional way, you miss the importance of that kind of playful, creative, sometimes artistic imagination in leading us to these new ideas. I would say one final set of kind of stories, another category that's crucial in Wonderland, and that's not just a question of inventing new technologies that delight or amuse us, but sometimes the most important innovations in society are more conceptual, or we redefine a certain space or create a new kind of institution that changes the world. Those are innovations too. It's not just about the iPhone and the internet. Sometimes it's physical spaces and what we do with them. And if you go back and think about the history of human progress, one of the things that defines it is just the sheer number of institutions and spaces, we're sitting surrounded by one, that are carved out specifically for people to enjoy in their leisure time, right? Again, this idea of kind of wonderlands that are specifically designed for people to have fun. It's not home, it's not work, it's not the church. It's a space, whether it's an IMAX theater, whether it's a golf course, whether it's a movie theater or a play. I mean, the world is filled with these, an amusement park. The world is filled with these spaces now. And they all had to be invented along the way. And maybe one of the first ones that kind of carved out this space for the first time is the invention of the pub or the tavern. This was one of the earliest places that was designed specifically for people to go and have a little fun, relax, have a few drinks, have some casual conversation away from home, away from work, away from the church. It's an ancient institution. And pubs and taverns have been essential to particularly political history. I mean, you can't tell the story of the American Revolution without talking about the network of pubs and taverns in New England. That was the information conduit that led directly to the Revolution. That was where the Declaration of Independence was read aloud. That's where common sense was read aloud. That's where a lot of these kind of seditious thoughts first started to emerge. It's probable that the American Revolution would have happened had the pub or the tavern not been invented. But it would have, by definition, required a different information network and a different social space for those gatherings to have happened. And we think about the history of the gay rights movement, right? Think about how central pubs and taverns and bars are to that history, from Stonewall Tavern in Greenwich Village to the Black Hat here and in LA. Those were the places where people for the first time were able to have a kind of semi-public identity in a time where homophobia was the norm. the bar was a space where these new identities could be explored for the first time and where solidarity could take form. So that space alone is really important. My other space that's like this, and I'm obsessed with, and I keep writing books about this because it's so interesting, I think, is the coffee house. The coffee house was central, particularly in London, to the history of the British Enlightenment, the development of coffee houses. London went insane for coffee right around the time that those fancy stores were appearing. Men, because these stores were, coffee houses were male only, started gathering in these coffee houses in such a number that Charles II actually, again, just like Calico and Chintz, tried to ban them. And he sent out this edict banning the coffee houses in London. And he had a great line. He said that these coffee houses are causing people, they're distracting people from their lawful calling and affairs. They're just wasting their time drinking coffee all day. And he bans coffee houses, and that ban lasted for 1 week. Because people were like, no way, we can't give this up yet. But he actually had it exactly wrong, and this is really the argument of the book, that things that look like people are just wasting their time, these spaces turned out to be incredibly generative. The British Enlightenment really happened in coffee houses. Think about the economics of it. Lloyd's of London, the first real modern insurance company was Lloyd's Coffee House. It emerged out of coffee house conversations at a place called Lloyd's. The magazine publishing business began in coffee houses. The first displays of what became the British Museum, the first truly public museum, were first displayed in coffee houses. A huge number of scientific ideas and political ideas of that period came out of coffee houses. Benjamin Franklin, in my book Invention of Air, I wrote about this. In the many years that he lived in London, he used to hold court at a place called the London Coffee House, appropriately enough. And he had this scene of kind of a posse that would meet him there. And out of those conversations, just an endless number of breakthrough ideas in politics and in chemistry and electricity and publishing came out of that scene at the London Coffee House. And actually, when I was researching the book, I was in London and I wanted to see if there was a plaque commemorating where this coffee house was, because it's a huge part of our history, and again, we don't celebrate these spaces enough. So I tracked it down. It's right by St. Paul's Cathedral. No reference to it whatsoever, but I swear to God, there's a Starbucks exactly where this coffee house was. So they're keeping the torch alive. They don't really realize it, but it's part of it. And so these spaces, the importance of these spaces where that you can have these kind of casual conversations where it's not directed by a single mission of kind of the workspace or a university department, where interesting new combinations of ideas can happen. These are crucial spaces in our history. And the other thing that happens a little bit after this is a change in the relationship to outdoor spaces. One of the things that's funny looking back on it now, particularly from a place like Marin, is if you'd asked most Europeans in kind of 1700 or 1750 what they thought about nature, they would have said that nature was appalling, that nature was the thing they had tried to escape. There was this sense that the natural world was the idea of kind of soaking in a beautiful scene in nature was something that people just didn't do. In fact, there's hilarious literature about how people considered mountains to be just horrifying scenes. So people would be on carriage journeys going by the Alps, and they would ask to be blindfolded to avoid seeing the kind of monstrous, jagged cliffs of these mountains, because this was danger, this was threat. The cities were where you were going to be safe. And that started to change in the late 1700s, early 1800s, in part because of the Romantics and sometimes scientists who were arguing for exploring nature to learn about nature. And by the middle of the 19th century, people start to think of nature itself as a kind of play space, as a wonderland that one can go and enjoy and savor and take vacations in. And they invented this great technology called the Claude glass. And the Claude glass was this device. It was basically a mirror that had little etchings in it, kind of like the mirror was slightly cracked, these tiny little lines in it. And you would go to visit the natural scene and experience its beauty, and you would turn around and look at it in this mirror, and the effect of the little cracks in the glass made it look like an oil painting, basically. So you would turn the image that you were staring at into an image that made it more aesthetically like a painting. So it was basically an Instagram filter, way before we even knew what Instagram was, or before really, or just as at the point at which photography was being invented. And that, of course, that changed relationship to nature, not a technology, but a true innovation in our mentality and the way that we think about the world, led to some extraordinary changes in the design of spaces in our lives. It led to a great flowering of urban parks. This is Prospect Park near where I live in Brooklyn. And these are some of the great, and we talk about the values of immigration and diversity and globalization. You go to Prospect Park, on a busy weekend, and all the cultures of the world are hanging out in this space, having fun. A space designed specifically for their leisure, for a sense of nature in the middle of a city of 8 million people. And it's unlike what the kind of American carnage that we hear about. It's a space that is incredibly at peace with itself and at play, and comfortable with that diversity. And that itself is an incredible achievement, something that we really didn't exist 200 years ago, and that we should really be celebrating. But it's not just urban parks too. I mean, it's national parks. Think about the unbelievable bounty of natural beauty that we have in this county. I took this picture just a couple of weeks ago at Fort Cronkite in the Headlands. So the idea of preserving spaces for their natural beauty, which of course then becomes central to the environmental movement, all these things came out of the sense that nature and the environment was something that we could enjoy, that we could delight in, that we could find wonder and amusement in as well. So it has changed literally our backyards as well as all the technology that we use. I think that when you look at the world this way, it has a number of implications for kind of day-to-day life, for the way that we think about our organizations, right? The first is, how do you create inside of a work environment that sense of playfulness? How do you unlock the sense of a mind at play, which is just a more imaginative kind of creative state? Part of it is sometimes in the way that you design the space itself where people work, creating more of that kind of coffee house-like culture, getting rid of conference rooms, and creating spaces that are more open-ended, where there's more kind of fluidity of idea exchange, like those coffee houses. Creating spaces where people's outside interests and passions and hobbies can come into work and influence people. I was just at Etsy, the wonderful Brooklyn company that makes kind of sells handcrafted artisanal goods all around the world. And their offices are amazing. They instead of having like a foosball table like so many tech companies, they have musical instruments everywhere. And it turns out they're based in Brooklyn, and if you work at Etsy, by definition, you have like an indie band that you're also in at night. And the founder of the company was a great musician, and so they decided to make that part of the culture. And so you walk around, and there are people cranking on their jobs, but then, there's an acoustic guitar here, and there's a grand piano here, and there's a band room that's soundproof with a little recording set up, so people can go and play, at the end of the day or, during lunch. And it creates this beautiful environment and culture that says we expect that sense of playfulness is something that is important here. We know that you're going to bring that. We want to encourage that. And we want to create a space that encourages that. And I think, a place like Marin, with the history of companies like Pixar, maybe, one of the most playful companies you can imagine, that ethos is something that comes naturally to us. And the final thing I'll say is, it's also relevant looking at the world this way, I think, in terms of an economic context, because so many of these things end up being predictions of future events. If you're trying to figure out what is coming next, looking at what people are doing for fun now, what the kids are doing for fun now, is often a really good way of getting a glimpse of more serious changes coming to society or politics or the economy. So if you were sitting there in 1750 trying to figure out about this future of industrialization and automation and programmability and the digital culture, all these things that were coming that were going to change the world over the next 200 years, probably the best place to be to make that prediction would have been not, in Parliament or on the battlefield or in a church. It would have been in that drawing room looking at those automated ducks and thinking about what would develop out of this toy, really. What new technologies, what new ways of organizing labor in our machines would come out of this playful origin. And that I think, is something we can think about today in terms of our own lives. What are the kids doing? What are people doing for fun? And where is that going to take us? You will find the future wherever people are having the most fun. Thank you very much. a couple questions or comments or your own observations about play. Yeah, right there in the back. Yeah. Yeah, it's such a great question. Yeah, I talk about it a little bit at the end of the book, and I've actually, my kind of thinking on it has developed a little bit since the book came out. So a lot of what I try to look at in the book are things that don't satisfy our basic needs, right? So there's, I talk about spices, but I don't talk about, basic food in the book because, you need proteins and you need carbs. And so the fact that we have an appetite for it, just like the fact that we have an appetite for sex, these are things that biologically we need. Everything in Wonderland is really stuff that we don't need in a survival sense, but nonetheless we like, right? So the question is, why do we like it and why do we seem to spend so much time with it? What is happening? And one of the key things is, there's kind of two answers to that question. One of them is surprise. So what we do have is a very elaborate brain system that we share with many other creatures, which is our brains are wired to pay attention to surprising things. So when the world confounds our expectations about how it's going to work, we pay attention. It's a system largely, kind of modulated by dopamine, which is, not a pleasure drug, but a drug that focuses attention and motivates us, right? And what you see in almost all these things that I've talked about, they're quite different, and there are even more in the book, but one of the things that they all share is that when they first appeared, they were surprising in one way or another, right? It was like, oh, I haven't seen a defecating duck before. That's interesting. Or, this cloud glass is pretty cool. I hadn't looked at a mountain that way before. And what happens in that situation is interesting because our brains are drawn towards surprising things. But surprise as a measure is basically, by definition, a moving goalpost, because what was surprising to your parents is no longer surprising to you, right? It's already been in the world. You grew up around it. It's not surprising. So being drawn on an evolutionary level towards surprising phenomena actually pushes us as a culture to invent new kinds of surprise. So we're constantly having to come up with new ways to make it more interesting and surprising, and that leads us to new ideas, and that leads us to new technologies, which then get used in more traditional ways. So it's an interesting thing in the sense that you have a biological drive that pushes cultural innovation, right? So it's not the normal kind of nature, is it nurture? It's like a nature that causes to come up with new forms of nurture in a way. And the other thing I would say is there's a lot of interesting studies of other, mostly mammals, that display play-like behavior when they're young. And there seems to be a very clear correlation between the length of time that there's playful behavior in kind of childhood and the grown-up, the adult, their kind of open-ended intelligence and creative problem solving in the creature. So foxes, for instance, have a very long playful stage. Dolphins have a very long kind of playful stage. And I think that the argument that people make is that play is useful as an educational strategy, and this is one thing we could talk about what this means for schools, because there's a huge amount to say about this. But if you're trying to train an organism to grow up into a world where there is a predictable strategy for dealing with anything, then play is not a good way to train them. You just teach them the strategy. If there's just, you got to do these 5 things, this is all you need to know, go. Memorize these things and go do it. If the world is going to be surprising or changing and the environment is unpredictable, play is actually a beautiful way to train the mind to be open to new possibilities and new strategies and flexible in its thinking. And so we see that as something, and of course human beings have the longest period of kind of playful childhood and adolescence of any of the mammals. So we're better at playing than any other species, and no coincidence, we're also the smartest and most adaptable in our thinking. So that's the other side of the kind of evolutionary story. Maybe one more question? If there is one? Or maybe we just, yeah, good.
They're a way of indulging the whims of people with wealth.
Yeah.
And so have you considered a level down economically of how the flute came about? I mean, you can keep going and how there's play at every level. And so I see that not being represented here.
Yeah, it's true, but it is more, that's just, I suppose, the slides that I ended up choosing. But yeah, there are, I mean, it starts, one of the earliest things that the book starts with, there are bone flutes that date back 60,000 years in hunter-gatherer societies. You know, one of the first technologies that human beings designed when they had a whole world of things to invent were flutes, which is pretty striking. They had no, you know, accumulated wealth and, you know, no advanced society, but they were like, well, we could make these interesting air patterns that sound nice to our ears. Same with ornamentation and jewelry, you know, 100,000 years old, their necklaces and beads. The other story that I love in the book is when Columbus comes to the Americas on the second trip, he is hanging out off of modern-day Haiti, and his men are kind of on the beach, and they see these indigenous people from Haiti who are playing a ball game with their feet and with their hips, actually. And they're watching them, and they're like, what is the deal with that ball? It's so bouncy. And they can't figure it out. And what they're seeing for the first time as Europeans is rubber. And basically, Mesoamerican cultures had figured out a way to vulcanize rubber almost 1,000 years before Goodyear did it. And they built an entire elaborate, the Mesoamerican ball game was a huge part of those societies. And Columbus and his men brought the balls back to Europe. And again, this idea of the power of this new interesting material and the kind of material science behind it was kept alive by gameplay for 150 years. People were just like, Europeans just sitting there bouncing these balls going, it's crazy, it seems to defy physics. I don't understand how this happens. They'd never seen anything so bouncy. Until 150 years later, Goodyear and other people are like, wait a second, we could make tires of that, and you know, it becomes a huge industrial material. But you know, again, that was an innovation that was coming from folks who didn't have that, you know, kind of modern European wealth, and there are a bunch of other examples of it as well. All right, thank you all so much, and hope you get to enjoy the book. Appreciate it.